Hi, my name is Chris Landano, and welcome to my exhibit at the Queensborough Community College Art Gallery. I was a student here at Queensborough Community College. I studied art and photography between 1996 and 2001. And in my time with the fire department that I was there in my first year, I applied for the New York City Fire Department's photo forensics unit. And having studied photo at Queensborough Community College, I met the requirements and I made it into the unit. And so on September 11th, I was assigned as a photographer to the FDNY'S photo forensics unit, and I responded down to the scene as a first responder. Even though I had cameras in my bag, I never took one photo that day. I felt more of a sense of helping people than I did photographing. However, on September 12th, my job was clear, being that, again, I was assigned to the FDNY Forensics Photo Unit, and that was their job. Our job was to photograph the rescue at the time, because there were hopes that people were trapped. And eventually, the rescue turned into a recovery operation in which the fire department was there on scene up until May of 2002. And as a photographer, it was my job to photograph the entire operation from September 12th straight through to the closing. And I captured thousands of photos from the ground, from the air, up in helicopters, and from different rooftops of buildings that did not collapse around the site. So now I will take you through the exhibition, and we will take a look at some of the photos here on display, and I can give you a little information on the photos. So you look at these photos and wow, it brings back so many memories. You know, it's crazy to think it was 20 years ago. These two photos down here were aerial photos in the week of the World Trade Center attacks. We were going up in NYPD helicopters, and we were photographing the scene from the sky. And so you could see these shots are definitely from an aerial helicopter. These were the photos from the recovery. I'm gonna guess that these photos were taken December of 2001, and sometime between early 2002. This was a compilation of photos sometime between September 12th and I'm gonna say December of 2001. What's interesting about these photos, and the first thing that came to mind when I was photographing these little bulldozers, and they're going over mounds of, you know, it looks like a junkyard, right? It looks like a junkyard in the middle of the city. And I always thought it was, you know, but an interesting photo how you have this junkyard of steel, and you got the buildings in the background. I always thought it was a very eerie photo. Again, these were from aerial shots, and definitely you could tell this was probably sometime in early October. Same thing, early October. I would say this would be late September, possibly sometime in September, and these were, I'd say, October, November. So these pictures are really emotional. These photos were definitely within the first week. You could see it's a rescue mission. You've got lines of folks. Rescue is heroes. These are the heroes. These are real heroes who were literally forming lines of just handing out debris and refilling the buckets. It was remarkable. You also have some photos of some rescued dogs. I heard a crazy story a few years ago. I ran into a canine operator, and he told me that after 9/11, a lot of the rescued dogs had died of depression in the years following, because they're trained to save people and they didn't find anyone. So I thought that was interesting conversation I had it with that gentleman probably around 2008. But all these photos, the scene was still very active, it was still very dangerous, and everyone, you know, if you were a first responder and you got access to the site, which was not easy to get access to, you had to be either NYPD, FDNY, you had to be approved, you had to be down there, you know, on official duty at some point. But I'd say the first few days, lots of people were getting down there and they were helping. More emotional photos, you got rescue dogs looking for a sense of, you know, life in the debris. You've got firefighters and other city agencies going down into the crawl space and the holes to see if anyone was down there. I mean, these are rescues, and these are different lines of folks handing debris from the site out to clear the way, and, you know, see if they could find any remains. You know, it was a crazy few days down there. It was surreal. Even just looking at these photos now, you know, I was so young in my career as a first responder with the fire department, but I had a job, and it was hard to photograph, but I had to do my job. I remember the first few days of being down at the site, and when I was photographing the emergency vehicles, I remember saying to myself, did they make it? Were they amongst the lucky ones? And unfortunately, some of them did not make it. True heroes. So in this photo here, this was Roger Clemens. Sometime in October, I believe it was, Roger Clemens wanted to visit the site. So I remember picking him up along with his lovely wife in Midtown Manhattan, and I drove them down to the scene, and we walked around the site, and him and his wife were so gracious. They literally shook everyone's hands. They were talking to the members that were there, the firefighters, the police, the EMS, all the folks that were there, part of the rescue and recovery operation. And there was one point where we came across the scene of a few firefighters, and we had a priest who came out, and he read a lovely prayer for everyone there. And this was a great photo of Roger Clemens at the site. There were, I'd say, a number of celebrities that did the same thing. You know, they went down to the site. It's kind of like a morale booster, showing support and solidarity for all the workers down at the site. And then this was a photo with then Mayor Giuliani, Commissioner Tommy Van Essen. This was, I think it was a prayer service at the time of, I'd say around October, and they were doing a prayer service for all the members that were down there working. It was like Sunday morning mass. So this was about, I forget where it was, but the site was maybe a block away from it, and just gave members a chance to come down and have a little prayer with the brass and the mayor and some of the elected officials. Besides firefighters and first responders from around New York City, we had first responders from around the country, around the world, that came to the World Trade Center and sent support teams. And it was really cool. These photos were all within the first week. And I do remember at one point myself and some other FDNY members literally exhausted, laying in the street. And I fell asleep, and I woke up like 3 or 4 hours later. I was exhausted. I literally took my gear, rolled it up, it was a pillow, and I went to sleep. I'll never forget that. But that's what it was like down there for the first few days. I mean, firefighters, EMS, you know, Con Edison, all the different agencies that responded down there. Members were exhausted. They worked nonstop. We had makeshift emergency rooms all around the site. This was on near 10 and 10. This was on the west side of the Trade Center. 10 and 10 was the firehouse directly across the street, and they had set up like a makeshift emergency room kind of triage anyone who felt like they needed some medical attention, that's where it was. Here's one dog, one rescue dog receiving oxygen. So that's kind of an emotional picture, right? And then, in between searching, members had breaks. They just sat and waited for their turn to go back onto the pile. But if you really look at everyone's faces, you just look at the emotion, the seriousness, devastation. People were just shocked that those towers came down. These are more photos of triage stations around the site, but this was what I was just talking about. This was 10 and 10. This was the firehouse directly across from the Trade Center. It acted as a command post, a place for people to go and feel warm and feel comfortable. Whenever you walk into a firehouse, you just feel, any firefighter, any first responder, you just feel like, you're at a place of, like when you go in church. You have that feeling like, you're safe. It's the same feeling like when you go into a firehouse or a police station. You just get a sense of like, family and security, you're safe. In the weeks following the World Trade Center, there were lots of funerals. It was the worst time in the history of the New York City Fire Department, having lost 343 members. So I had gone to a lot of funerals. Some funerals had nothing in it. Some of the funerals had, some parts in the caskets. But I also liked photographing American flags. In my history as a fire department photographer, I always once thought I would do like a collection of photos with the American flag in connection with the fire gear, but I never did. But it's just kind of a nice, it was a nice touch with the American flag on some of the members' gear, and unfortunately, at every funeral, you always see a flag draping. There was one day when I was photographing the scene and I heard the bagpipes going on in the background. And in my experience of any kind of event, when you hear the bagpipe is going, it kind of just lifts you up. It gets you excited. I feel like it's a shot of energy. And so what happened was the FDNY bagpipers were literally walking around the site in a certain area that they could get to, and they were playing their pipes. And it was like, I know when they were walking through the site, it was lifting people up. It was getting them excited, giving them hope. And it wasn't until maybe hours later when I was going through the photos that I caught his facial expression. And there's anger, there's frustration, there's curiosity, all in his facial expression. And this was probably one of my strongest photos. I always thought about it because it showed the destruction and showed his face, and just a picture that always stood out to me. These were photos going into the tail end, I would say, of the recovery, right? The first few weeks, it was a rescue, and then they made the decision to call it a recovery operation because they felt like no one would still be alive. And so I'd say you could see they dug out most of ground zero. Now they were below grade into the cellar of the towers, if you want to call it. So I'd say these photos were probably sometime between January and March of 2002. And I was on a rooftop taking these photos across from the Trade Center, and they just looked like little ants walking around on a pile of rubble. That's what I remembered envisioning when I looked at that photo. We will never forget. I will never forget. Most Americans will never forget. If you were a first responder and you responded there, whether you responded there on the 11th of September or you came down from another country you will never forget. You know, it's one of those days when veterans, you talk to veterans, they talk about those days that they'll never forget. Pearl Harbor, D-Day. This was our Pearl Harbor. Many people have forgotten, and it's those people who really had no connection to 9/11. Although I want to say that every human being had a connection, but in some cases, if you lost someone on September 11th, if you knew a first responder who was down there, you know, you will never forget. I will never forget 9/11, and for as long as I am alive, I will be here in solidarity with my fellow firefighters from my firehouse, and I will continue to pay homage and respect to all those who perished on that day. And I think it's really important that we never forget. I think it's even more important that we share it in schools, and we share it with kids growing up who weren't born on September 11th, 2001. And so I just ask that everyone never forgets.